Hey gang, it's Christmas time and we're in Los Angeles. We're actually in Glendale and we are at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. We're here at this beautiful chapel here, quiet spot on a beautiful day in December. And I want to tell you this amazing story that I came across of this, actually an Arctic explorer, a high Arctic explorer back from the early part of the 1900s, and his wife, and they worked together, and they worked with two newspapers. This is in the Midwest, 1929, and they all together put on a Christmas fantasy adventure trip for all the kiddies, and this thing grew and grew and grew. But in 1929, they went out and they did it, and it's the most amazing story. It's something I stumbled across. I think it's a completely forgotten story, and they really pulled it off, and they pulled it off to such a degree. Where did they go? They were looking for Santa in the North Pole, and they went up there, right? And they found all sorts of wonderful things, little bit reminiscent of the Polar Express, those things that they found at the end of the train journey. And this may be inspiration for a lot of the things that were in that movie, although there was a book, and who inspired that author? When you hear some of the things, you're going to be amazed. But they pulled it off. It's the most heartwarming story. We're going to go visit their graves after I tell you the story here at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park. But right now, let's take a journey up to the North Pole. So let's go. It was just before Christmas in 1929. Now, there were many children who were not believing in Santa Claus. And they would ask difficult questions like, how could he live for so long? How could he deliver all those presents to all those children everywhere in the world? And how could he know me or what I wanted? What is he doing to get ready for Christmas right now? It's just a few weeks away. And where did those elves come from? Were there really reindeer? And could they fly? So, there was a newspaper in Iowa called the Gazette, and it was soon to be joined by another newspaper called the Republican. And they got together and they said, let's get a real Arctic explorer to try to find Santa at the North Pole. And the mission was born. The idea would be to send them up there and for them to bring back pictures and movies of Santa. This, of course, was a good-hearted campaign that would be entertaining to the children, especially those children who didn't believe in Santa Claus. So it was that December that the Gazette announced that they were going to organize and outfit a high Arctic expedition to pierce the frozen north and answer these perplexing questions. The newspaper invited children to write letters to Santa telling why they believed in him. And the expedition would deliver these letters to Santa when they found him. And so it was. On November 13th, 1929, the Gazette said it had sent telegrams to 4 of the most noted explorers of the North, asking them to head the expedition. And the expedition was going to start at the earliest possible date. They said airplanes will be used for the main trip, and it would be for establishing bases. For the intensive explorations from these bases, the planes and dog teams will be used as the occasion demands. These were the headlines. One plane would carry a wireless radio to send messages back to the Gazette and motion picture equipment to record the journey as well on film. the Gazette named a Santa Claus editor. On November 16th, the Gazette announced that Frank Kleinschmidt was the man for the job. He would be accompanied by a companion plane with a special writer and cameraman from the Gazette and Republican. They would head north in the next week in search of Santa. The explorer's telegram of acceptance came from Mineola Flying Field at Long Island, New York. It read, "I accept with delight your proposition to pilot and head expedition to polar regions in search for Santa Claus. We'll have plane ready for takeoff when your companion plane joins me here. Wire then. Happy to undertake explorations for kiddies of the Gazette Republican and confident of finding Santa Claus. Await further instructions." Well, the excitement was building now, and every day the Gazette and Republican were putting out the updates. Frank Kleinschmidt, the Arctic explorer, actually did have more than 15 years of experience in the high Arctic. He was the real thing. He traveled with the Eskimos, as they were called back then, and their dog teams, taking pictures and making movies of them. There were polar bears, seals, walruses, icebergs. He had it all on film. And he also knew a thing or two about marketing those materials when he returned home from his trips. Two days later, on November 18th, the Gazette reported an unnamed reporter that they had and an unnamed cameraman and pilot. Pilot's name was Red Garland, and he had taken off for New York in a mammoth airplane. Garland bemoaned the lack of notice, noting children didn't get to see the Spirit of Christmas plane take off. Of course, in fact, there was no airplane that left Cedar Rapids. But the fun continued, and the Gazette reported that Kleinschmidt, showing his marketing chops, had ordered Red Garland, to bring along electronics from local businesses, a Hartman Aero robe, and a Philco radio, and they were to come from local Iowa small-town radio shops that everybody knew. So they continued the narrative, the Gazette reporting Kleinschmidt and his wife now, Margaret, was coming along, and they greeted the Cedar Rapids crew when they landed at Mineola Field there in Long Island. The planes were loaded with gas and oil, and those mail bags containing the children's letters, those couldn't be forgotten. They were all loaded into the mammoth airplane. They said, "We will make the very best time possible to the northern tip of Hudson Bay, and from there we will fly as far as we can with safety. If we find it impossible to reach Santa's home in the airplane, we will proceed by dog teams and reindeer, which will be provided by my Eskimo friends." The Gazette promised daily stories from the north via that wireless equipment that the expedition carried along. And making good time, Captain Kleinschmidt sent a message from 6,000 feet above Canada on November 20th, as Margaret, his wife, piloted the plane dubbed the Santa Claus Special. And by the way, this particular flight really did happen. They did send a message, but maybe they weren't that far north. But he reported, "Already the air is very cold, and we are fortunate in having our Eskimo parkas made of reindeer skins with us." A November 21st radio message was received from Fort Severn in far northern Ontario, and it was indicating snow and rainstorms. No wireless messages were received, causing some concern. But on November 22nd, the steamer Sea Lion found 2 planes floating on Hudson Bay near Fort Severn, floating in the ocean. Kleinschmidt reported in, "Well, after we had heavy rainstorms and heavy snow, the wind died down. We ran into fog and sleet was forming on our wings, and we were losing altitude. Then the sleet formed on the propellers. The wings themselves became so coated with ice, they lost their lifting capacity, and we were forced to land in the water. So we sent an SOS out, which brought us the sealing schooner Sea Lion, a Hudson's Bay Company boat especially built for combating the icy waters of the Hudson Bay." Well, the 2 landed in Victoria Island in the Arctic Ocean at about 4 p.m. on November 24th, after the 1,000-mile flight from their New York City base. With their wireless frozen, it was 40 below zero. They reported having to navigate by compass over the frozen tundra, and Captain Kleinschmidt then reported in, "Eskimos at this time of the year do not live in the snow houses, but they go underground in their igloos, the roofs of which are almost level with the ground." Well, back in Cedar Rapids, the Gazette's Santa Claus editor stayed up late on November 26. He was hoping to hear from any of the amateur radio operators who might have had contact with the Kleinschmidts. But there was no response. So the next day, just before press time, James Clark, an amateur operator in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, he had just relayed a message from the Kleinschmidts, and it read, "Unable to transmit message last night. We were surrounded by a pack of wolves and had to fight them off all night. We lost 2 reindeer, stopping only 2 hours to allow reindeer to feed before crossing Wales Strait. Tell all the children we are pushing north at full speed, and all indications denote a successful outcome." Surviving that ordeal, the searchers had to spend the night under the northern lights, but the explorers finally arrived in Eskimo land, the North Pole, on November 30th. Captain Kleinschmidt reported the northern lights were filling the whole vault of heaven and constitute the most beautiful, wonderful, and supernatural display the eye of man has ever beheld. At this point, the Kleinschmidts said a little old man about 3 feet tall with a wrinkled face and frost-covered whiskers approached them. Margaret Kleinschmidt asked him if he would like a cup of tea. He said yes. They asked him, could we meet Santa? Well, at first the elf was reluctant to comply with the Kleinschmidt's request, but eventually he said, "Although he is busy with work, I know one thing. He will never disappoint children, and I will tell him all about the great thing your paper is doing for the children in Cedar Rapids." Unable to pronounce the elf's name, they just dubbed him Jimmy Aid. It was the next morning, and the elf Jimmy Aid escorted the Kleinschmidts to Santa's castle. They were greeted by hundreds of elves waving and cheering. Among them was a tall, fur-clad figure who was smiling behind a mass of whiskers, white whiskers. It was Santa himself. "Welcome, Captain and party," he said. "You are now in the kingdom of Santa Claus. I'm going to give you the first handshake that was ever given to mortal man in my home. Come in." It was their first day in the castle, and the Kleinschmidts viewed giant rooms filled with millions of presents destined for children all over the world. On the second day, they rode moving staircases past floor after floor of elves working on toys and packing them for delivery. At the bottom, the chief elf and a large crew of machinists and engineers operated the North Pole powerhouse. Santa said he'd connected his machinery to the North Pole axis, and all the power that spins the earth drives all of his machinery, the lathes and saws and the drills. You know, he said, it takes a lot of power to manufacture toys for more than 50 million children each year. Well, the group then boarded an elevator that rose floor after floor, each named after countries. Getting off at the United States floor, they entered a huge library of ledgers. You are from Iowa, and here you are. He flipped through the pages, the one showing the Gazette wanting them. Make the boys and girls happy in eastern Iowa. The ledger was filled with names of the children who had written letters to Santa. The third day featured a visit to Santa's workshop that had hundreds of rooms. And on the fourth day, if that wasn't all enough, the group went to visit Santa's friend Jack Frost. And the fifth day, they visited Santa's magic observatory with a huge television telescope through which Santa could observe the behavior of children everywhere. And on the sixth day, they stopped at the Christmas forest for lunch, and they moved to the Easter Egg Valley to visit with the famous bunny, the Easter Bunny, and his wife. Then, finally, on December 8th, all reports from the North Pole stopped. Our intrepid explorers were returning home. Well, after the trip ended, the newspaper's focus turned now to the very real December 14th Christmas parade in downtown Cedar Rapids, which of course was sponsored by the Cedar Rapids Gazette and Republican and the Mercantile Bureau. Mild weather contributed to the record crowds. Everybody came out. There was a black and white silent film that was provided by the captain, which was shown in eastern Iowa theaters from December 15th until Christmas. The 20-minute film was described as a fantasy actually filmed in northern Alaska, but this was to be used for the fantasy trip. Well, the huge endeavor was a fantastic success, and all the kids loved it. From 1925 through 1941, this event would be repeated for the children all over the country. It had really caught on. Well, is that not a most precious story? The Kleinschmidts. Their graves are here, and I brought some poinsettias for them. And actually, Frank is buried here with, I believe it was his second wife. It is not Margaret. And Margaret was cremated. But he is here. He is here with Teresa Essie, right here. Essie was born in 1886, a few years younger than Margaret, and she passed in 1961. And it says, my dear wife. And here is Captain Frank Emil Kleinschmidt. He passed in 1949, not 20 years after this all started. What a great man. High Arctic explorer. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about the family. They had 3 daughters. I will start with Margaret, just so we know. We do know that she died many years later after Frank did, as did Essie, Teresa. But Margaret had died on August 29th, 1862. She was 81 years old. She died in Seattle and, as I said, was cremated. And Essie here, Teresa Evelyn Essie Filion Kleinschmidt. She died July 11th. July 11th in 1961. She was 75. She died here in Los Angeles. So Frank and Margaret, I believe it was Margaret he had the 3 daughters with earlier. There was Dorothy May. Her last name would be Mulvihill, 1907 to 1975. And Margaret Grace Kleinschmidt Webb, 1907 to 1994. And then Helen Gertrude Kleinschmidt Huff, it's 1911. She was the youngest, passed in 2008. Now, Captain Frank Kleinschmidt here and his wife Margaret, back in those days, produced a precious, memorable silent film. It was in 1925, 4 years before. 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. And they tell a famous story. And they mix in a lot of their Arctic black and white film reels, the icebergs, the seals, walruses, polar bears, and other wonderful things. And I believe it is Frank who plays Santa in that film. And that was a convenient film to dust off in 1929 for this special event. I will put the YouTube link. It is on YouTube. But I say hats off to these amazing newspapers and to the amazing Kleinschmidts for bringing some special Christmas cheer for all the many, many kiddies back in those good old days. Merry Christmas, everybody. Merry Christmas.